The moment I noticed the depth gauge was wrong, I had already been underwater for 47 minutes. Not broken, not drifting. Wrong in the specific way a dial is wrong, when the pressure around it has changed without the water itself moving. I remember staring at it for longer than I should have, suspended in the blue-black nothing of the lava tube, with my regulator clicking steady and my fins barely moving, and that number sitting there like a word I had misread 3 times and still could not parse. 14 meters. I should have been at 22. I floated a moment longer, trying to reverse engineer it. My tank pressure was normal. My computer confirmed the depth independently, and my computer agreed with the gauge. So I was at 14 meters. The tube had simply risen around me without my noticing. That happens in flooded lava systems. The floor tilts. The walls carry you. You think you are moving horizontal while the whole passage angles up. I told myself this. I almost believed it. What I did not tell myself was why the water had changed color. Coming in, the tube was the deep indigo you get off the Philippine coast, when the thermocline sits clean, clear water all the way down to the volcanic rock. But somewhere in the last 8 minutes, the color had shifted toward something greener. Not dramatically, not enough that I could point to the moment, just a slow bleeding of green into the edges of my lamp beam that I had been registering and filing away as unimportant until it was no longer possible to call it unimportant. I checked my compass. The bearing was right. The guideline I had run on the way in was still clipped to my left hand. Yellow and bright and steady. Everything said I was fine, but something about the tube felt narrower than it had on the way in. And I do not mean the walls. I mean the quality of the space itself, the feeling of being in a place that had less room for you than it had before. I turned and started back. The line is everything in a flooded cave. You lay it going in, you follow it going out, and as long as the line is intact and in your hand, you are never truly lost. I had been diving flooded lava tubes on this island for 3 years. I had run line in worse visibility than this, in worse conditions than this. The line was there. My lamp was at full power. I was fine. I pulled along the guideline for maybe 5 minutes before I understood that something had happened to the passage behind me, not collapsed. I want to be precise about this, because collapsed means rock displaced, debris field, the kind of obstruction you can identify and potentially work around. What I found was not that. What I found was a section of the tube where the walls had drawn together, smooth and even and without any of the fracture patterns you would expect from a pressure event or a slide. The opening was still there. I could see the line continuing through it, still clipped to a piton I had set in the rock on the way in. But the gap between the walls was perhaps a third of what it had been 40 minutes ago. I hovered in front of it for a long time. My training said, measure it. So I measured it. My tank would not clear the opening. The opening was approximately 60 centimeters at its widest point, and my cylinder plus my backplate was 83 centimeters across. I know this because I checked the exact number against my equipment log the following week, trying to confirm what I already understood to be true while I was floating there in the dark. The part I have never told anyone comes next. I switched off my lamp. Not permanently, 4 seconds, maybe 5. I needed to know if there was any ambient light coming from the other direction, any other opening. Anything to tell me the tube had a second exit I had not mapped. It is a technique, not a panic response. You do the check. You gather information. You stay methodical. In those 4 seconds, I heard something. I am going to try to describe it accurately, because I spent a long time afterward wondering if I had described it to myself inaccurately. It was not a grinding or a cracking sound. It was lower than that, and it came through the rock rather than through the water. A slow pulse, rhythmic, about the spacing of a resting heartbeat. Once, twice, Then a third time, and on the third pulse the water around me moved. Not a current, not a surge from outside, a single expansion, outward from the walls, pressing against my suit with a pressure that lasted perhaps half a second, and then released. I turned my lamp back on. The gap in the wall had narrowed by another 4 centimeters. I did not wait. I pulled off my tank, secured my regulator hose with my teeth, and pushed the cylinder through the gap ahead of me on its side, then pressed myself flat and scraped through after it. The rock was warm. That was the detail that stayed with me afterward. Warm in the specific way a surface is warm when it has been generating heat from within, not absorbing it from without. I felt it along my forearm and across my back, and I kept moving, and I did not look at the walls. I reconnected my tank in the passage on the other side, and I finned hard for the exit. The tube widened again as I went. The color came back to indigo. My depth gauge settled to something that made sense. 20 minutes later, I surfaced into sunlight, and the sound of waves against the boat hull, and a flock of terns wheeling overhead, and I sat in the water for a while before I climbed the ladder, because I needed the world to feel ordinary again before I got back into it. I filed my dive log that evening. Equipment nominal. No significant observations. Uneventful return. 3 weeks later, I went back to map the section I had turned around in. The passage where the walls had narrowed no longer exists. The tube simply ends, smooth-walled and featureless, as though it was always that short. My piton anchor is gone. The rock where I set it shows no mark. I have no explanation for this that I am comfortable repeating out loud. What I do know is that the gauge was right, that the warmth was real, that the interval between pulses was exactly the same as the interval between the slow contractions I measured with my watch before I stopped measuring and started moving, and that somewhere in a dive briefing I read years ago, in a section on working lava tube systems off the Visayas coast, there was a single handwritten note clipped to the back page that I did not think about until I was on the boat home. It said only this: if the rock feels warm, do not wait to understand it. I have no idea who wrote it. I have looked through every file I own. I have asked the 3 other divers who used that briefing document. None of them remember seeing the note. I think about what that means sometimes. That someone wrote it down. That they knew exactly how specific to be.